Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to decode the invisible, underlying strategic forces behind one of the most successful tech ecosystems in human history. We're going to use the business model canvas framework to figure out exactly how Apple is navigating a massive industry shift, and honestly, how they're actively trying to turn a looming hardware crisis into a multi-billion-dollar services empire. Let's get right into it. Okay, so here's a critical question we need to ask right off the bat. What actually happens when the world's most profitable product, kind of stops experiencing rapid innovation? For years and years, the smartphone was this unstoppable engine of massive growth. But as with all technology, as it matures, that engine inevitably has to slow down. But hey, before we start crunching numbers, let's just look at human behavior for a second. We've all felt the judgment of the green text bubble, right? It sounds kind of funny, but it's a very real social phenomenon where teenagers literally dread being the green bubble. When an Android user pops into an iPhone group chat, those blue bubbles turn green, and suddenly you lose all these features. It seems trivial, but man, it shows how Apple has masterfully cultivated a tool like iMessage into a massive social lock-in mechanism. It's not just a phone anymore, it's a social network. And to really get why this lock-in is absolutely crucial for Apple right now, we've got to look at the broader state of the industry. Act 1. The hardware commoditization problem. The reality is the smartphone industry is shifting. We're moving from this wild, rapid growth phase into a highly mature market. People are holding onto their devices a lot longer nowadays. The technological leaps between generations are just getting smaller. Plus, there's intense price competition from regional vendors globally. And when devices start to become largely undifferentiated, they get treated like commodities. That directly threatens Apple's historically massive profit margins on hardware. So the big question is, how does a tech giant survive a plateau in its hero product? Act 2. Apple's business model canvas. To really understand Apple's structural defense, looking at their business model canvas reveals a pretty brilliant pivot. Notice how their value proposition shifted from just selling you a cool, standalone gadget to offering this unified, practically inescapable ecosystem. And if you think about their key resources, they aren't just hardware parts anymore. We're talking massive brand equity and tightly controlled proprietary platforms. But the most important part is their revenue streams. They are evolving incredibly fast to offset that exact hardware commoditization we just talked about. The crucial takeaway here is this major strategic pivot. Apple is actively moving away from relying purely on single-purchase hardware sales, which carry high manufacturing costs and shrinking margins. Instead, they're capturing highly scalable, recurring revenue through software and services. Think about it. Once an app or software is developed, you can distribute it to millions of people with incredibly low marginal costs. And this brings us to the real savior of Apple's bottom line. Act 3. Services. The profit engine. The contrast here is just wild. The gross profit margin on services has been climbing all the way to a massive 70% by 2021. Meanwhile, the margin for devices hovers way down around 35%. This perfectly illustrates the economic why behind Apple's whole ecosystem strategy. The hardware gets you in the door, absolutely, but the services, that's what generates the outsized profits. By fiscal year 2024, the revenue breakdown tells an incredible story. Sure, the iPhone still anchors the business, right there at 51% of total revenue. But services, which includes the App Store, Apple Pay, iCloud, and Apple Music, now makes up a massive 25% of the total pie. And remember, because those services have roughly double the profit margin of the devices, every single percentage point of growth here disproportionately boosts Apple's overall operating profit. It's an absolute goldmine. But how do they actually ensure you keep paying for those services month after month? Well, this high-margin engine runs on something economists call indirect network effects. Basically, it's a feedback loop. The more people who buy an iPhone, the more attractive the iOS platform becomes to app developers. As developers build more innovative apps, the iPhone becomes even more valuable to consumers. It's a brilliant, self-reinforcing cycle that essentially traps both sides in a highly profitable loop. And Apple actively engineers this walled garden to ensure consumer single homing, meaning you only use their ecosystem. They pull this off through that iMessage social pressure we mentioned, through ensuring your Apple Watch really only works with an iPhone, by enforcing mandatory App Store commissions, and by creating that seamless cross-device iCloud syncing. Now, Apple maintains that this ensures security, privacy, and a premium user experience, but the ultimate business reality is that the switching costs, the sheer headache of moving to an Android device, become painfully high for the consumer. However, that exact strategy of deep lock-in, it has now caught the attention of regulators all over the world. Act 4, cracks in the wall. This massive lock-in strategy has created a legitimate existential threat to Apple's current business model. If we track the rising tide of legal challenges, it really kicks off with the high-profile Epic Games lawsuit over App Store fees back in 2020. And that momentum leads right into the massive U.S. Department of Justice antitrust lawsuit filed in early 2024, alongside the strict new compliance demands of the European Union's Digital Markets Act. Looking specifically at the U.S. Department of Justice, the allegations are severe. The DOJ is essentially arguing that instead of competing on merit, Apple is using its gatekeeper position to systematically suppress any technologies that might lower those high switching costs. The complaint alleges that Apple blocks multifunctional super apps, suppresses mobile cloud gaming, which would let people bypass expensive hardware, and purposefully limits third-party smartwatch features just to protect the Apple Watch. So how do they propose fixing it? To restore competition, legal experts and regulators are pushing a step-by-step approach. First, mandating equitable interoperability, meaning third-party gear has to work exactly as well as Apple's gear on an iPhone. Second, supporting alternative app stores on iOS to break the distribution monopoly. And third, ensuring cross-platform data portability so you can easily move your digital life to Android. The goal here isn't to destroy the products. It's to pierce the walled garden and realign the platform with normal competitive behavior. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We've seen exactly how brilliantly Apple used the business model canvas to pivot to high-margin services to survive hardware commoditization. But if regulators actually force Apple to dismantle the walled garden that locks users in, can its incredibly profitable services empire actually maintain its dominance on a truly level playing field? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the systems you use every day.